You're listening to Fanfiction Factory, the show that takes you to parts unknown with familiar faces and familiar places. And now, he has a flow so tight not even Eminem will call him out, Draco from Gatorbox.
Hey. Let's not start beef with Eminem, of all people, on Fanfiction Factory, alright? I don't want any trouble coming my way. Listen, just because Eminem is too scared to call me out because he knows I've got the flow, let's not turn that into something bad. Nintendo, everybody. Nintendo, thank you for the intro. I certainly appreciate it. Welcome to Fanfiction Factory. I am, of course, Draco from Gatorbox, the aforementioned Draco from Gatorbox. Got to use those SAT words. And if you're listening to this podcast, it should be September 10th, 2022, if all has gone well with the release schedule of this show. And, there's there's kind of a unique anniversary right around the corner. And that, of course, is the anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States of America. September 11th, 2001, when members of Al-Qaeda flew two hijacked planes into the New York City Twin Towers, as well as one into the Pentagon, and another and a fourth one that had a destination unknown but was taken down and crashed in a field. It was a terrible tragedy. There was a great loss of life, forever changed America. I think today we're still feeling the ripples of September 11th, even to this very day. It was that pivotal of a moment right there in that brief period where we were getting towards the end of the 90s and getting into the new millennium, and there was all this optimism about what the future could possibly hold, and then for this to happen, it really just made everything take a different direction, and the world is different today because of it. And one thing that is interesting to me is that this was really the first major terrorist attack, the first major event of the digital age. And on places like fanfiction.net, there were people who wrote fanfics that involved characters reacting to or being a part of the September 11th attacks, either as tributes or to write something dramatic or to write something heartfelt. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. That's why today's episode is called the 9/11 episode. It doesn't have a witty name or anything like that. It doesn't have a quote from something as its title. We just decided to call it the 9/11 episode. The first story that we have for the 9/11 episode is called The Arthur Gang Pays Tribute. It was published October 4th, 2002, so literally, 1 year after the initial attacks. This is 2002 again. The description of the story is Arthur, DW, and their friends from the popular PBS series Arthur visit New York City to reflect upon the tragic events of September 11th, 2001, and pay respect to all the victims. So we're going to open up a can of worms here and feature our first 9/11 story on Fanfiction Factory. Here is Arthur and the Gang Pays Tribute. It was a gray, overcast day at the Ground Zero location of New York City. A huge crowd was gathered around the entangled heap of remains of the two tall World Trade Center towers that once stood there. They were getting ready to pay their respects to the fallen victims of the September 11th tragedy. Then, off in the distance, the crowd noticed a tall staff with the United States flag attached to it, waving in the wind. Somehow, it was slowly headed towards them. So the side of the crowd that was nearest the upcoming flag split off into two sides, making way for whoever was holding the flag. As the crowd looked at the flag coming up the newly created pathway, they slowly started to see the kids who were marching their way through with the flag. The way that the crowd's faces suddenly lit up when they saw them told you that they weren't just any group of kids. They were the Arthur kids. All the children in the crowd immediately recognized them and gawked and smiled in disbelief upon seeing their most favorite PBS characters in real life. Arthur was holding the huge U.S. flag on the staff. He was dressed up as Uncle Sam. To the left of him was his sister D.W., dressed up as the Statue of Liberty. She was holding a little flaming torch in her right hand and cradling a bouquet of roses in her left arm. Both of them were in front, leading the way. Behind them were the other kids lined up into 2 lanes. They were dressed in red, white, and blue clothing. In the right lane were the Brain, Francine, Binky, and Sue Ellen. In the left lane were Buster, Muffy, Prunella, and Fern. These kids were each holding a candle in front of them. They all had solemn yet steadfast looks on their faces. When the group reached the edge of the Ground Zero area, they halted. To all the victims of the September 11th attacks that occurred in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, said Uncle Arthur, holding the flag up high, and to all the families and friends of the victims who have had to suffer enduring pain over this unprecedented loss of their loved ones, said D.W. Liberty, squeezing the bouquet of roses in her arm for comfort. Then Uncle Arthur and D.W. Liberty stood their ground while the other kids split off in opposite directions, forming a large ring around the Ground Zero area and standing in a certain position around it. Their candles flickered brightly in the gray air. Sue Ellen spoke first. "We are gathered here today to pay our respects, sorrows, and condolences to all the innocent lives that were cruelly and abruptly lost in this most heinous act of terrorism," she said solemnly. Then she closed her eyes and bowed her head down, holding her candle out in front of her. Binky was next. He had great anger in his voice. "This whole thing was caused by these extremely insane and stupid terrorist guys who hijacked our planes, using them as bombs of mass destruction and crashing them into the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon," he said. Then he closed his eyes and bowed his head down, holding his candle out in front of him. Next was Francine. She also had anger in her voice. "Those terrorists hated our powers, our freedoms, and our liberties. They hoped to weaken us by creating terror in our country, thinking that it would rip us apart at the seams in fear, confusion, and hopelessness. Well, we will work our darndest to never, ever succumb to any of their dirty wishes." She then closed her eyes and bowed her head down, holding her candle out in front of her. Next was the Brain. This attack was the biggest attack ever on U.S. soil. The impact it had on the whole country, as well as the whole world, was enormous. While we have gone through much pain, suffering, and grieving from this, the attack has also caused us to come together and unite in ways never seen before. He then closed his eyes and bowed his head down, holding his candle out in front of him. Next was Buster. Our biggest hearts go out to all the rescue forces, the firefighters, construction workers, policemen and women, medical people, and civilian volunteers who toiled night and day to rescue the few survivors, unearth all the other dead bodies, and aid the injured civilians and rescuers. Some rescuers even died in the process of doing their job. We commend you very deeply for all of your heroic efforts. He then closed his eyes and bowed his head down, holding his candle out in front of him. Next was Muffy. Our biggest hearts also go out to the immense number of people in the United States who greatly aided the efforts by donating blood and sending money to many charity organizations such as the Red Cross and the September 11th Fund. We commend you all as well for your altruistic help. She pulled out from her pocket a $5,000 check that she was going to give to the September 11th Fund spokesperson later on. She held the check next to her candle as she closed her eyes and bowed her head down. Next was Prunella. So, as we all stand here today reflecting on the bitter events of last September, let us be given the strength to mend ourselves and rise again, and to combat and conquer terrorism in all its ugly forms. She then closed her eyes and bowed her head down, holding her candle out in front of her. Finally was Fern. These evil terrorists will be severely punished for what they have done to our country and the world. We will find them, and we will bring them to justice. She then closed her eyes and bowed her head down, holding her candle out in front of her. Then Uncle Arthur and D.W. Liberty marched through the debris of the tower leftovers until they reached the very center of the pile. D.W. Liberty spoke again. September 11th will be a day that will forever live in infamy in the United States of America. But with all of us coming together, uniting as one, and caring and loving for each other, we will learn from this, get through this, and work very hard to make our world a better and safer place to live. She took out the roses from the bouquet bag and arranged them in a small ring on the ground. Uncle Arthur held up the U.S. flag mightily in the air. And so, in conclusion, my fellow Americans, Uncle Arthur wants you, he points to the crowd, to never forget. And with that final note, he slammed the end of the staff right smack into the center of the rose ring. The crowd exploded in thunderous applause at the speech and dramatic planting of the U.S. flag. They watched in pride as Uncle Arthur and D.W. Liberty hooked up shoulder to shoulder and watched the flag ripple mightily in the wind. D.W. Liberty lowered her torch down to her side. After a while, the applause slowly died down, and then everyone had his or her head bowed, praying and grieving in silence. Within the crowd, there was one man in particular who still had his head up. Bystanders knew him only by his initials, M.B. M.B. just couldn't take his eyes off Uncle Arthur and D.W. Liberty in the center. A strange, bright ray of sunlight had permeated through the gray-cast clouds and was now shining directly on the center spot of Ground Zero. But they didn't notice this as they stood together with their eyes closed, praying in silence. The innocent sight made M.B.'s heart melt, and he cracked a sad smile as the tears streamed down his eyes. "Don't worry, Uncle," he whispered to himself through blurry eyes. "We will never forget. God bless you, your sister, and your friends. God bless all of the victims, sufferers, and heroes of September 11th. He looked up at the U.S. flag waving majestically in the air. And God bless America." The end. I don't know why I always instinctively chuckle at the end of reading a story. It's just sometimes getting through a story without laughing and chuckling at it, and then at the very end, the absurdity of it sinks in. Like the opening saying, all the children in the crowd immediately recognized them and gawked and smiled in disbelief upon seeing their most favorite PBS characters in real life. Who the fuck watched Arthur? Come on. I mean, I know a lot of people did, because there is a lot of Arthur fanfiction out there. Trust me, there's a lot. The fact that the very first Arthur fanfic showcased on this show is a 9/11 fanfic is nothing compared to I mean, can I click on this and find out real quick how many there are? Okay, so how many stories are there per page? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10... 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So, okay. So there's 25 stories shown per page on fanfiction.net. And, browsing through page, it shows that there are 927 pages of Arthur fanfics. So if we just do a little math here, 927 times 25 per page, that winds up being 23,175 fanfics just for Arthur. And this is the first one that we've chosen to feature on the show. So there's a lot of it out there. So I guess a lot of people did wind up watching Arthur. Arthur was I was too old for Arthur by the time it came out, and it just went completely under the radar for me. So I mean, I know who Arthur is. I know Arthur mostly through the memes. Not necessarily the Arthur's Fist meme. That's a little more contemporary. I'm more talking about the older memes, like when Buster says, "Do you really think somebody would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies." Like, those are the kinds of that's how I know Arthur. And the screenshot of DW looking at the sign saying, "Good thing I can't read. This sign doesn't apply to me," or something like that, something to that extent. So, like, that's how I know Arthur. That's it. I've never seen an episode of the show. That's all I know it from. But, I mean, Arthur's an alright show, I guess. You know, I actually have a friend of mine who did grow up watching Arthur, and he said it was great. And I know toward the end of the series run, they had a character come out that was gay, and I think that's great for inclusivity, that's great for diversity, that's great for teaching, good morals and life lessons to the kids who grow up watching these shows. So, you know, there's some good in Arthur, but I just couldn't let this story slip through the cracks. I had to feature it just because of, again, how absurd it is. It's not a bad story. It's written very well. It's put together very well. It's just so bizarre. It's so out there. It's so misguided, I think is the term that's best to use. This is a person who wanted to write something meaningful in the wake of the first anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And when they couldn't think of how to do it, they couldn't think of how to frame it except through that of an Arthur fanfic. And when you think of it with that mindset, you start to understand how Fanfiction Factory works. You start to understand the underlying, plan of this show, the underlying theme of this show. So that was the Arthur Gang Pays tribute. Stick around. Don't go anywhere because we've got one more story for this particular episode. And if you're a fan of Tiny Toons Adventures, well, then you might want to, buckle in because we've got Tiny Toons coming up in just a second. All right, well, we've got one more fanfic picked out for this episode. It's just a doubleheader, nothing special. And this story coming up is called Tiny Toon Aftermath. It was published on September 11th, 2013, 12 years to the day of the September 11th attacks. And this is another tribute / anniversary style fanfic. It's another tragedy fanfic. This is a tragedy fanfic, whereas the Arthur one was more inspiring, I guess you could say, if that's appropriate to call it that. Anyways, the description of this fanfic reads, from Acme Acres in 1995 to real world New York City in 2001, the Toons are taken from their world into ours on the night of September 11th and are shocked to see the aftermath of that morning's attacks. What ensues is quite powerful and heart-wrenching, tribute to all who died or lost loved ones on the tragic day of 9/11. The story has a lengthy author's notes before it begins. They read, greetings, everybody. As you know, today is the 12th anniversary of the hellish tragedy that was the 9/11 attacks. And since I made some fanfic tributes for the horrid events in the last few years, it's only natural that I would make one this year. Anyway, the franchise I'm using this time is the one and only Tiny Toon Adventures, and interesting enough, there's actually a picture on the site DeviantArt of Babs and Shirley hugging one another in tears while remembering that awful, tragic, and horrific day. Seeing said picture was part of what spurred me to use Tiny Toons Adventures as the basis for the 9/11 tribute of this Patriot Day. Since Tiny Toon Adventures ended in 1995, if you count the specials that came after its end in 1992, I'm having it so that the characters emerged from their world into ours on the night of September 11th, 2001, and specifically into New York City. Never in their lives have any of them seen the likes of this, and it's going to leave quite the mark on them all, though not in a good way, obviously. May all who died on that day rest in peace. I hope this tribute is as powerful and heartfelt as I'm aiming it to be. And then, of course, there's the disclaimer that says, I own none of the characters. They belong to Tiny Toon Adventures. Technically, that's incorrect. They belong to Amblin Entertainment, but we're splitting hairs here. Anyways, this is Tiny Toon Aftermath. Night. But not just any night. This was the night which had followed a morning in which all hell broke loose in a way less than fathomable, and the most unexpected, and for that matter, most unlikely of individuals were seeing it all. You see, there had been some kind of very unexpected and inexplicable phenomenon which had generated a portal from our universe to the next, that just happened to be the Tiny Toon Adventures universe to the real, original one. It came as quite the surprise to the numerous characters in the show who were suddenly sucked in onto the real-world Earth, and specifically out of Acme Acres and into New York City. And I've got to point out here that it wasn't just on any old regular day either. No, far from it. It wasn't even during the day, really. It was at night. At night, on a dreadful, dark, deadly, and devastating day, the day of September 11th, 2001, in which the outright unthinkable had occurred. Monsters who had the audacity to wear human flesh and appearances had hijacked 4 airplanes and done all they could to see the deaths of as many Americans as possible, as well as the destruction of as many important national symbols as possible. For the most part, they had succeeded, as 2 of the planes had flown into and destroyed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, and another of them had slammed into the Pentagon. Though the Americans in the 4th were able to stop its terrorist pilot from reaching its target, said pilot crashed the plane and took his life along with all of theirs. The people in the other planes were all killed too, and so were a lot of people inside of the World Trade Center towers, whether they were those above or in the impact zone, who all died except for 18 very, very, very lucky ones, those who tried to leap out of the building and fell all the way down to the ground, who also all died, and with no exceptions, or those of whom who did all they could to get down the stairs and escape, some of whom succeeded, but as for others, alas, they were not as fortunate and lost their lives. 9/11 heroes who did all they were able to do to save as many as possible either were badly hurt, not unlike many other survivors, or were killed along with the innocent bystander victims. Some lives even got lost in the gigantic cloud of smoke, ash, debris, and toxic fumes that followed the collapse of the towers. When the horrific tragedy had ended, by which time everyone who was still living where the events took place was understandably frightened, justifiably enraged, and predictably sad, be they innocent civilian or be they everyday hero, almost 3,000 lives had been lost, and there were 6,294 people who both gotten badly injured and been taken to a hospital for said injuries to be treated. The attacks cost nearly $2 trillion in damage and lives lost, and it was a day which would scar America, as well as the rest of the world, for the rest of forever. For the rest of forever. That was the morning of that day. This was the night, and a dark night it was indeed, not just because it would be dark at night, anyway, but because that day had been among the darkest, if not the darkest, in the history of not only the world, but also the universe. And though the trip of the portal from their universe to this one, the Toons had been made to know by mystic kinds of effects, which was part of the portal, where they had been taken, what night it was, what had in the morning happened, and what was going on now. Understandably, they were shocked beyond words while learning it, and didn't want it to be true. They really hoped to God that their ears all deceived them and that it wasn't true, even as the most obnoxious and unlikable of them all, such as the likes of Montana Max, Roderick Rat, Rubella Rat, and the like. Unfortunately, no miracle was to be seen, as before their very eyes, as they entered the real world on the night of 9/11/2001, it would be made clear that what could be considered the most nightmarish of possible things was now an awful, unspeakable, and unthinkable reality. Though they were silent for a time after they saw the remains of the World Trade Center, as well as everything left in the aftermath of the attacks, and this of course was understandable and quite surprising, all things considered, the first of them to bring himself to say anything was Buster Bunny, who put both of his hands over his mouth with both of his eyes wide open and said, "Dear God, we are not seeing this. This can't be real." He'd feel hot tears flow out of his eyes and down his cheeks, knowing what seeing the destruction that was in front of him and the other Toons meant. Babs Bunny was crying as well, and she looked to Buster going, "I'm sorry, but it is real. I wish I could say otherwise, but..." She broke down in tears and hugged Buster, who hugged her back as she buried her face into his chest. Though the way the portal to this universe from one they were previously in had, through its magical effects, made it so certain Toons were put into different spots of the region of Ground Zero they were currently in, the mood and emotional feelings of every Toon, regardless of how different or similar they were or weren't otherwise, was most assuredly the same. The same as what was currently felt by the two bunnies. Just a few feet away from where Buster and Babs were, Furball and Fifi LaFume were clinging to one another while crying their eyes out, though like everyone else present, they kept their ears open in case a sound was heard to indicate they'd have to put their grief and pain on hold and take action for reason or another. The two best friends, Hampton and Plucky, were as teary-eyed as they both were shaking with rage, barely keeping it together as they gripped each other's hands. Of course, there wasn't a single Toon not shaken with rage along with saddened to tears, but it was Plucky and Hampton. It was somehow particularly evident, much like it was with the aforementioned Buster, Babs, Furfall, and Fifi. Calamity Coyote and Little Beeper were in a different region of the area, and while they tended to fluctuate between being close brothers and friends and being rivals, though the latter happened somewhat more often, they both knew this was too serious to do anything but embrace and cry over. Calamity's nice personality made it so he was not unable to be sad, and in spite of Beeper usually having a mean, cocky, and jerky attitude, it was penetrated fully by these grave events, and he was crying just as much as Calamity as they hugged, though this hardly lessened the pain any. Even for those who were normally enemies or villains to the good Toons were united and joined with them in grieving. Tears and mourning for the dead and innocent or heroic lives lost. It may have seemed unusual since it was not like Monty, Sweetie, Roderick, Rubella, Danforth Drake, Margaret Mallard, Big Daddy Boo, the Boo Sisters, Arnold Pitbull, and Johnny Pugh to cry at all, but they did so here and knew that those all of them typically were foes with a shared common mourning right now, and vice versa, because some things are more important than feuds. Some things surpass rivalries, enmities, and the like. There are certain things that even the bitterest of foes would not let their distaste and dislike for one another overpower or get in the way of, and this was a tragedy which was well beyond that which would not be required for something to qualify as such a thing. The ones you just read of all may have been nasty, rotten, obnoxious, arrogant, bad, unlikable, and or greedy, but they were not heartless, and especially in the midst of the most despicable act and unforgivable atrocity in all of mankind. So they knew that the ones who were normally adversaries to them were here, and vice versa, but both groups all just accepted that and joined in crying for the death of the least deserving. Even the ever calm and centered Shirley MacLaine was not able to stop herself from crying hard for the dead, and the normally excitable Go-Go Dodo, Dizzy Devil, Elmira Duff, Foulmouth, and Julie Bruin were at this time feeling nothing but pain and sadness, as well as fury and lament. The tears went down their faces in multitude, and for good reason. Even the young, innocent, and naive little Sneezer and the well-meaning but dim-witted Concord Condor could both understand enough of what they'd learned to know that a whole lot of lives had been destroyed, and that those people were not coming back. As well as how tragic and unspeakably terrible all of this was, to put it very lightly. They clung to each other in tears, Sneezer's being so little and Concord's being as nice and usually optimistic and oblivious to any danger as he was, though this wasn't the case for him now, making it so they were hit harder than most by this. And that was indeed saying a lot. And when it came to Bimbet Skunk, she might have usually just been a flirt and a ditz who was nice enough but also pretty oversexed, but here, now she exhibited feelings she almost never did. Agony, upset, grief, moroseness. She looked down to the street and cried. Her tears hit the concrete of the region of the road she stood on and above enough times to create puddles. Even if she wasn't the sharpest tack in the box, she by all means was smart enough to know how god-awful, horrible, tragic, and unthinkable this was, in addition to how monstrous and soulless those who did the deed were ironically now dead the way their victims were, as well as in hell, of course, had to have been. When it came to the likes of Byron Bassett and Bookworm, who were usually respectively asleep or dozing off or caught up in a book or another, neither was in their usual state right now. Good Lord, no. On the contrary, they were weeping for the dead, for the unfortunate and undeserving of said death innocents who had done nothing but unknowingly be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though from the point of view of the fiendish abominations who caused all of this, it was in the right place at the right time, but I digress, given that, from the point of view of anyone and everyone with a heart and or soul, it was all certainly very wrong indeed, be it the place those innocents were in, the time it was at, or the attacks themselves. Of course the terrorist reprobates who engineered them were wrong, and so were Osama bin Laden and all of the other members of Al-Qaeda. Anyway, Byron knew that he wasn't falling asleep anytime soon, in stark contrast to how he usually was. These were by no means normal circumstances, though, and he'd both shed tears and let out a howl of mourning for the ones who lost their lives in this tragedy as a mini requiem of sorts. And Bookworm, knowing that there would be no escape from this hell-on-earth reality even if he had 10 books to read, which, unusually for him, but understandably in this kind of situation, he was not in the mood for even one of, accepted what he knew was fully inevitable. His endless reading might have diverted him from the rest of the world a lot of the time, but it also made him smart, and he was easily smart enough to know how serious and wrong all of this was, so he let the tears come out. He cried hard until his eyes ached, and he didn't even bother acknowledging it when he could tell he was in a puddle of his own tears. This was a matter far too serious, way too saddening, and much too enraging. Soon enough, his glasses were wet from tears enough so he couldn't see through them, but it didn't matter. What he'd seen was more than enough to make him know this wasn't going to get any better. Then there was Mary Melody, as well as Bertha Bovine, who, though from two different schools and of two different species and personalities, not to mention how one was good and the other bad, plus both had wound up in a different area than the others, whether they were as good as well as heroic like Mary or bad as well as villainous like Bertha, could not deny or ignore what at this time they were feeling and doing, and their feelings were the same as everyone else's. That meant they were in tears and feeling sadness, upset, distress, shock, anger, rage, and fury on such levels that they never thought possible, in a way they never had before, and didn't think they'd be capable of feeling, especially in Mary's case, seeing as how she was much nicer and sweeter than Bertha. Nevertheless, there was no refuting their current states of emotion, and though both were well aware that their schools were rivals, and that they, along with the rest of Acme University and Perfecto Prep, were ordinarily enemies, both schools were united as one, and together in this right now, and Mary and Bertha were certainly no exception. In the end, they were hit so hard by the knowledge and sight of this tragedy that their usually being bitter rivals along with the rest of their respective schools towards each other notwithstanding, they went up to each other and then hugged. They couldn't believe they were doing this while crying together, all things considered, but they knew it was happening and that they were unable to help themselves. Soon enough they heard noises and sounds which could only be identified as Danforth and Margot, Sweetie, Little Sneezer and Furball, Plucky, Hampton, Foulmouth and Shirley, Buster and Roderick, Babs and Rubella, Fifi, Bimbette and Johnny Pugh, Big Daddy Boo and the Boo Sisters, Julie, Byron and Concord, Monty and Elmira and Arnold, Bookworm, Calamity and Beeper, all doing much the same thing they were. The fact there were some rivalries or enemies among some of these lots hugging and crying together notwithstanding, of course, it was quite unusual for anything of this sort to happen, but then again, this was not an event to be considered usual or ordinary at all, not by a long shot or by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, while the Toons grieved and cried for God only knows how long, especially in light of how none of them had ever seen in their lives the likes of this, and that this was the first time they ever saw something of this magnitude, made it all the more shocking and horrible for all of them to see and know about, they were suddenly made to go from sad to startled when the lot of them heard a cry for help. See, they'd obviously been feeling incalculable levels of anger, upset, sadness, distress, shock, fury, hatred, for the terrorist, obviously, grief, obviously for the dead innocents and heroes, disheartenment, moroseness, and anger for some time now, and for good reason. That it was the kind of tragedy that made it so it didn't matter to Buster and Babs that Roderick, Rubella, Monty, and the Boos were part of this, nor vice versa, and it didn't matter to Bookworm that Sweetie was part of it, nor vice versa, and it didn't matter to Sweetie or Sneezer that Furball was a part of it, nor vice versa, should predictably and understandably be a further signifier of how devastating, shocking, appalling, and all around serious and significant all of this was. As should how it didn't matter to Mary Melody that Bertha was part of this, nor to Fifi or Bimbette that Johnny Pugh was part of it, nor to Plucky or Shirley that Danforth or Margot were part of it, nor to anyone that Arnold and Elmira were part of it, especially after such fact was made evident by the aforementioned hugging and then crying together you just read about. However, hearing the aforementioned cry for help snapped them out of it all, and a lot of them could tell they had work to do and a chance to maybe save one innocent life. So they all joined together, disregarding which ones of them were longtime friends and which of them were their either rivals or temporary enemies, due to knowing this was much more crucial, to say nothing of considerably more serious and important, and looked about everywhere from where the cry from help had been heard. Soon enough, due to working together and covering as much ground and as many angles as possible, two of them, Furball and Fifi to be exact, were able to find two afraid, injured, and trapped children, one boy and one girl in the rubble, alive but hurt bad and in need of medical attention. Though their eyes teared up at the sight of how heartbreaking this was, they ignored the tears and Furball called out, "Arnold!" He rarely spoke, but this was urgent enough so he'd need to, and thus did. Arnold turned to where he heard the call from, and Fifi called out, "Please help us here! There are children trapped under here who we need to free!" Arnold ran over and by means of his great strength was able to lift the part of the wreckage the kids were trapped under for Furball to snatch the boy and Fifi to grab the girl, and for both Toons to run far away enough from the rubble and debris so the children were free for sure. Arnold then let go of it and jumped back, landing a couple feet away. While Fifi and Furball did all they could to console and comfort the frightened, injured children, Arnold went to call an ambulance when he saw one of the city's payphone booths a few feet away. Luckily, he had a few coins and used them to get a call for the aforementioned ambulance. While he was making his call, other Toons had made a few other finds. I know this is off the rails, and this is completely insane, but I should just point out that 9/11 or 911. God damn it. 911 is a free call from any payphone. You don't need to put coins in to call 911. Anyways, back to the story. You see, Buster and Roderick, as well as Babs and Rubella, Plucky and Danforth, Mary and Monty, Shirley and Margot, Calamity and Beeper, and Hampton and Elmira had found some other people in need of help. Men, women, and children alike, all of them alive but hurt bad and also trapped and unable to get out one way or the other. They were also unable to speak due to how much damage and harm had been done to them, which means that if they hadn't been found now, they would most surely have died due to not being able to call for help and how they were difficult to find under all the destruction and remains of the World Trade Center, especially at nighttime like it was now. Thankfully, they were found, and while none of the other Toons in any other places managed to find anyone else in need of help, they were able to help when they were called over by the ones who had found these people, and the combined efforts of everyone who helped them out after that were just enough to free those innocent, still living, but severely injured victims and get them away from the rubble and wreckage. Even so, it was no easy task, and it felt quite weird and strange for Toons who typically went for each other's throats to be working at the same task and goal, side by side. None of them ever thought they'd see the day it happened, especially the bad ones, but here it was, and knowing there was no way around it and this was too dire an issue anyway, they accepted it and did what they needed to do. After they'd rescued the people they'd found and gotten help saving, Beeper and Calamity worked together to call ambulances for them. As in, Beeper and Calamity ride him as he zoomed over to a different payphone booth that Arnold wasn't using, and Calamity hopped off, then used some coins to get it ready to use, and instead of holding up signs like he usually did, this was one of the incredibly rare times he spoke actual words. Little Beeper would have been surprised if he wasn't aware that how much was at stake made it so Calamity couldn't afford to do his usual sign-holding MO right now. It happened that Calamity had said after calling 911, "Hello, I need some ambulances and paramedics right now. There are people who are alive but in serious condition who need to be rushed to the hospital as soon as possible, here in Ground Zero. Get here quickly, please, if you can." He got off the phone, and then Beeper, in one of his rare moments of actually speaking, said, "Nice job, Cal. Now we just need to wait." Calamity then told Beeper, "True enough, but we've got to help comfort and treat those people in any which way we can while waiting." Beeper nodded, and both of them made their way back to where the other Toons were consoling the injured innocents, as so to lend a helping hand, paw, or wing. Additionally, after finishing with helping those children, Fifi and Furball had joined in lending a helping paw and hand in comforting the new finds once they learned of them, and Arnold was doing much of the same thing after finishing his call. Though they comforted those men, women, and children to the extent was possible, all of the Toons having, of course, done their part in this perfectly, and to the fullest extent they possibly could, it still hurt like hell to see the frightened, injured faces of the innocent people they were taking care of until the ambulances arrived to rush them to the hospital. Just like it hurt like hell to know such an atrocity as this had taken place in any universe, this original real one or otherwise, and while the Toons did their best not to cry, given this was no time to do so, since they were in the middle of tending to, helping, and caring for those in need of it most, their eyes still looked full of tears, since they were. None were shed, but it was all too evident that they were on the verge of crying, and simply refusing to do so because they had a lot to focus on in terms of helping those who would soon be taken to a much-needed hospital at this moment. As soon as the ambulances arrived, everyone took part in getting the people into the ambulance they would need to be in one way or another, in one form or another, and it all led to how the people in the ambulances were as comfortable as they could be and in a position which increased how much of a chance to survive they had, as much as it could be increased, which admittedly was no more than a little bit, given their serious conditions and how it was simply a position in which of the ambulances they were in, but it was better than nothing, especially since no increasing the chance they had to survive was too small for any of them. They would be taken to the hospital as soon as it was all done, and those who could speak, just before the doors closed, spoke for everyone in an ambulance when they said, "Thank you, Toons. We'll never forget this." All of the Toons simply nodded, and Buster spoke for all of them when he said, "Of course, any time." And as soon as the ambulances had driven to the hospitals, the Toons got onto their hands and knees and let out the new tears they'd been suppressing all this time. They even buried their faces in their hands, and although as it would turn out, the ones all of them had helped would be lucky enough to survive after their treatment and being cared for in the hospitals they went to, they didn't know that at the time seeing how badly hurt they were on top of seeing the horrendous events caused them to cry even harder this time. Though this was perfectly understandable, knowing what kind of circumstances they were under, that which had just been added to them. them. Their tears kept coming down until something else startled them and got their attention, and it just happened to be the shine of the moon, but it wasn't just plain old regular moonbeams. Oh dear me, God, no. And it's funny I should say such a thing as that, because through the full moon could be seen the face that was having those beams shine down upon them, namely the face of God. And he said, "Toons, I commend all of you for your efforts and how they've paid off. Though it both saddens and enrages even one as forgiving and loving as I to have seen such an unforgivable atrocity as this take place this morning, and one on a level that even I, my son, Jesus H. Christ, could not possibly forgive, as it was the worst sort of act of pure evil there ever was, and I've seen plenty of those, given I created the universe all of those eons ago. I can assure you I've also seen the future, given my omnipotence, just as I saw all of you put your differences aside and let your friendships come together, it being varied among who's who, and of course, am most proud of all for what you have done to help as much as possible. And I can assure you that Osama bin Laden will pay for his inexcusable and unpardonable crimes, be it one that happened today, or any of the ones in the past, or still to happen in the future. And those people you saved will also survive after their treatment in those hospitals. The Toons were relieved to hear the last two parts, but were also surprised to be truly spoken to by the Supreme Being who was the Almighty God. God went on. On a side note, though you are all here to stay in this time and world, I can assure you that your futures will be favorable ones, as I've used my powers to make it so all of you have a home in a special apartment building, and so that everyone knows you are here and to be part of New York City now. You deserve such a good home as that, and a good life as I've paved the way for happening. After all, you've had to see, be, through, get done. That you have very, very many fans in this world only adds to how your futures will not be in doubt, which is what you deserve at the very least after all of this, along with the aforementioned home and citizenship of this city. The Toons all nodded and accepted what was to come, with Fifi speaking for all of them when she said, "Merci Dieu." Then Merry Melody asked, "By the way, God?" Furball's words spoke for all of them when he said, "Not that it makes any difference one way or the other, given that we're grateful for these gifts you've bestowed upon us and are relieved to thank you for how you've made it clear those people will not die and Bin Laden will pay for his sins, but we're unable to help but wonder, the portal that brought us here from Acme Acres, was it yours?" A reply from God came out as, "Yes. For I could see you would be needed here for what was left of the attacks at night in New York City, and for various reasons saw you as the best picks for what needed to happen. You proved what I knew to be right more than ever with how well all of you did your jobs, and as sad as you were made me know more than ever I'd chosen the right ones, as only those who, regardless of exterior traits, truly have a heart and soul deep down at their core, could possibly react to this tragedy as you did. You have done that which needed to be done most efficiently, and may neither you nor anyone else ever forget this fateful, horrific, and tragic day in which the world cried and America was left a permanent mark upon the worst of the worst concerning criminals and or terrorists. The Toons all nodded, fully understanding why they'd had a purpose and why they'd been chosen for this, and they stood up, put their left hands, paws, and wings upon their hearts, did a salute, and a second later with their right hands and paws and wings, looked to each other, giving a firm nod with disregard to whether they were friends or foes, both under normal circumstances and making it so on this night. They were one and the same, a united group who stood tall and would never for a second forget this shocking, horrifying, terrifying, and traumatic tragedy of a grave event. Just as the face of God disappeared from the moon, they saw a momentary vision of heaven, and they saw both the souls of the innocent bystanders and heroes who'd lost their lives in it, as well as all of the angel hosts of heaven and Jesus Christ himself, with God now in full form, sitting on the throne of heaven. Once the vision disappeared, they knew why it had been seen and exactly what it meant. All of them knew it was now high time to make their way to their apartment building, in light of how there was nothing more they could do here, and they all needed a good long sleep after all of this, especially since they knew God had to have made it clear which room of which part of the apartment building went to which Toons, and that the rest was they needed to be good and ready for adjusting to their new lives tomorrow morning, given it was now pretty much official they were newcomer New Yorkers. A single fact was certain: they'd never forget the day when they were introduced to their new lives in this world and city anyway, if it had happened in any way, for any reason, but it was most firm and for sure they'd never forget when it was on the never-to-be-forgotten and heinous hellish hell on Earth Day and night of September 11th, 2001, and they decided that once in their new beds they would say a prayer for both the ones in heaven and the ones in the hospital, even knowing the latter would survive, and for the families of those who were either dead or injured and therefore separated from said families, plus all of the world, given Bin Laden still being alive right now and Al-Qaeda still existing, was sure to present danger and problems in the near future, especially after these saddening, infuriating, and scarring events. The end. Well, that was a lot to unpack. That, according to my recording, that went on for about half an hour. It took me half an hour to narrate this nightmare. It's written in about 8 or 9 paragraphs. It's solid walls of text, and I actually cleaned these podcasts up, but there were a number of times that I stumbled over lines because this author just writes sentences that go on and on and on and on and repeat themselves. You see how many times I said vice versa in that one part? Yeah, like this is very meticulously put together in such a way so that the language is as strongly worded as possible, and there's a lot of repeating going on, and that messes with me because as I'm trying to read this, I'm like, did I already read this? And makes me think I accidentally started reading the same line of the story again. But no, it's just that this story goes on forever and it doesn't actually ever end. Or at least it feels like it doesn't. But let's just take a while to unpack this story. Let's break it down. There's a portal that opens up and takes the entire cast of Tiny Toons Adventures from Acme Acres and transports them to New York City. It's like the plot of Space Jam, but in reverse. And essentially, everyone from the show. This person was naming side characters that appeared in maybe like 1 or 2 episodes, and they all came aboard the portal as well. So everyone opened up. And this was a portal opened by God Almighty himself, which we'll get to in a second. But it put all of the Toons in New York City at night, and they all just immediately start crying because during their journey in the portal, the information was put into their heads what had happened. And so when they got here, they knew that 9/11 had happened, and then they saw the wreckage, and then they just started crying. I feel like I'm talking like Christopher Walken at this point. You know, like they came to New York from the portal and they saw the wreckage, the rubble of the Twin Towers, and started crying. That's what I feel like I'm talking. It's so hard to explain this story. And then they find people and they call a payphone, and this person clearly doesn't know that 911 is a free call on a payphone because both times that a payphone is used, a character has to put coins in there. And I guess to invoke the feelings of how serious this is, they had a Calamity Coyote call 911, and he is mute. He never talks. He always holds up signs because he's the counterpart to Wile E. Coyote, and I guess they had him speak to convey the gravity of the situation, that he gets over his muteness, or his selective muteness, I guess, for the sake of talking to the 911 operator. And then, when all's said and done, God himself shows up in the moon and talks to the Tiny Toons, and then thanks them, and then says he's hooked them up with an apartment in New York City. An apartment for like 25 fucking characters. Like, is it the whole building? Like, it's just one room? One apartment in New York City is not going to fit 25 people in it. Have you seen apartments in New York, God? I mean, come on. So, I guess it doesn't confront the elephant in the room in that if God is omnipotent and all-seeing, why didn't he intervene with these attacks? This story chooses not to go there, so I'm not gonna spin the atheist argument on you, but I just feel like this story was so off the rails that it actually uses the phrase Jesus H. Christ, which I don't actually know if that's Jesus Christ's full name. I don't know if his middle initial is H. I haven't read the Bible front to back, so I don't actually know. But it feels like Jesus H. Christ is a thing that people say. I've heard people say it before, usually like sarcastically or when they're surprised or just fucking around. But this story when I read it and just saw how off the wall it was, I had to include it. It's so bizarrely hyper focused and repetitious, and then God shows up and I'm like, okay, this is making it in. I know the story is very long and it's going to take me a while to read it and people are going to get bored of it halfway through, but I have to read this for the podcast. So if you've made it this far in the podcast, congratulations to you. You are one of the real OGs of this show. I appreciate it. Let's check out the comments. There's actually some comments for this story. Here's one that just says, wow, just wow. I can't even begin to fathom the emotions I felt reading your story. I wasn't even aware of the tears coming down my face until I reached the end. I felt everything the characters were feeling throughout as if I were there with them. You truly brought out a truly saddening, heartbreaking, tragically horrifying, yet also beautiful and hope-filled story. Well done. Well done. So that person was clearly moved by it. I wasn't necessarily moved by it. I'm not crying. Here's another comment saying, I know you meant well when you wrote this piece, but I must say that when you were describing the characters' emotions toward what happened, I found your choice of mentioning almost every single character in a paragraph to be a bit long-winded. This is merely my opinion, and in no way am I trying to be disrespectful towards you or your piece. Here's another comment. I couldn't read the whole story at the time, just the first half of it, but I hope I can read it better when I can. But my favorite part was when one of my favorite couples, Fifi and Furball, helped out those kids from the rubble and tried their best to comfort them. Let me tell you, I'm really touched at the prospect of cartoon characters like them comforting hurt children. It's kind of a weird comment. And then finally, my favorite comment left on this story is, it says, on April 19th, 1995, the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, I saw Tiny Toons' hair-raising night on Fox as I was waiting for Animaniacs. Where were you on the day of the Oklahoma City bombing, huh? This guy remembers. He was watching Tiny Toons because he was waiting for Animaniacs on Fox. Duh. I can't remember where I was on April 19th, 1995. I didn't commit that one to memory. You know what? Talking about remembering where you were, I remember where I was, on 9/11. And I guess I'll close out this episode with my personal story. On September 11th, 2001, I was still in school and, I was in class, going to my classes like normal. And around second period, I noticed there was like everyone started rushing around and all the teachers were like putting their televisions on and putting it on CNN on the news. And everyone was talking about it. And I missed that because during third period, I was an aide for the special education class. And they had a TV in there, but the teachers didn't put it on for obvious reasons. So I was like, what the hell's going on? What the hell happened? And my teacher said, somebody has crashed a plane into the World Trade Center. And I was confused because there's actually an indoor market near where I live that's called the Trade Center. And at first I was like, somebody crashed a plane into that piece of shit? But then I realized, I'm like, oh, I saw the television later. I'm like, oh, Jesus, it's the World Trade Center in New York City. And by that point, the second plane had hit the second tower. And shortly after that, the first one wound up collapsing. And I was just that day, there was no work being done in school. We went to our classes, the bells still rang, and we got up and went to class, but in every class, the teachers were just glued to like CNN or whatever. They were just watching the news. No work was done. No homework was given. There were no lectures. There was no teaching. There was no nothing. It's just we got from one class and went to another, and the TV was on, and we watched the news horrified. So that's where I was on 9/11. I remember that day. Don't remember the Oklahoma City bombing, though. That's going to do it for Fanfiction Factory this week. Like I said, this is one of the longest episodes we've posted because the second story that we just read was kind of hard to get through. But thank you for listening to the podcast. I sincerely appreciate it. And until next time, I am Draco from Gatorbox, signing off.
Fanfiction Factory is a production of Gator Company. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/gatorbox to make a pledge today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next journey.